Well, thank you, Jenny, for joining me here to talk about a topic that you've really brought to my attention. And just really appreciate us having this space to dialogue about something that's very complex. You and I are both trauma specialists, and we're talking about our connection, our relationship to religion and to religious communities, religious practice. And, you know, you and I have already talked about that the word trauma doesn't quite fit in all categories here because it's so complicated, and there's so many different sides to our relationship to our religious upbringing, our religious faith, our religious community, and in our families. And so I just thought we could take a little time to unpack some of the complexity. I know this is a topic that is very near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, thank you actually for creating this chance for the dialogue, because as we've mentioned in the past, I think there's plenty of room for more discussion.
Yeah.
And non-polarized discussion, a place where we can address the complexity of this issue. So thank you for creating the opportunity.
Yeah, happy. I'm looking forward to our conversation here. So, you know, I wondered if you could just share with us, just real briefly, maybe just, you know, what brought you into being interested in this, and what it is that you're doing with your clients and supporting in your community that might help, just help us have more information or more awareness about some of the complexities about religion and how religious trauma can happen.
Yeah, I notice that the question, well, I notice I'm responding to the question like I have already done a lot of research and have really created a niche for myself where I'm exploring this with a lot of skill and expertise. And I think really I want to put out that this is a conversation with myself that feels very new, even though it's been ongoing for maybe 10 years, but new in the context of trauma and new in this really nuanced, complex vein of being able to hold my experience and my client's experience, to be able to name and hold what's beautiful and what's good, and how I have developed and grown and benefited from all of the wonderful things of my religious upbringing, but then also to be honest enough and brave enough to be able to point at the things that were harmful and painful.
Yeah.
So all to say that I would love to sound like I'm an expert, but I feel like, yeah, I feel like I'm just beginning to explore these layers. So another reason why I'm glad that we're having this conversation.
You know, religion and faith is such a big part of human experience and of culture itself. And I liked how you said it before about like holding both the beauty and what it provides for us, and also the ways that it can go wrong and it can actually cause harm for us, and that we don't want to split. We don't want to, like you mentioned, get polarized in this. And so I, you know, again, I just wonder, when you're working with people or when you're holding it for your own experience, you know, how do you do that? And what are the different elements that you're kind of holding there?
My goodness, that's a really great question. It might be helpful to point out that what I'm really, really interested in is religious trauma syndrome, which is a term that Dr. Marlene Winkel has coined, and she's a psychotherapist out of Berkeley. And specifically what that is folks that are transitioning as adults, young or old adults, out of fundamentalist religious communities. And the reason why I'm interested in how NARM could apply to religious trauma syndrome is because of how you pointed out in a conversation we had once that that a religious community, especially a fundamentalist religious community, is an extension of the family, of the attachment system. And so, so I, for example, was raised in a Mormon family, and this is back, I was born in the 70s, so grew up in the 80s and 90s. that not all Mormons are going to have the same experience, right? So I'm pointing out that I grew up in this time period because it's different then than it is now. I grew up in California, although I live in Utah, and so that's a different political flavor as well. And also, my family system took it pretty seriously. I mean, I was raised very strictly in a religious context, and I think my own nature, the way that I came to the planet, first of all, I consider myself a very, I don't know if spiritual is the word I want, but soulful is close to what I want to describe. I mean, I'm cut from that fabric. And so my religious upbringing, like I took it really, really seriously. Mm-hmm. Like even as a young child, like I was internalizing all of what I was being taught and taking it to heart. Mm-hmm. And plus some, you know. So all to say that really affected my development, my identity in particular, was all couched in these terms, in these contexts of why I was a human being on this planet, what my purpose is here in this life, where I'm going after I die, and how I can live my life now to affect where I go after this life is over. And so when I transitioned out of Mormonism about 10 years ago, and I'm 44, so 34, I mean, that's a good amount of time for your identity to set up. It was, I mean, look, I'd like to say that it was this kind of smooth process, but I mean, it was really messy and painful. And I mean, it was an existential crisis, really completely disorienting. So, yeah, I think I'm kind of rambling a little bit now, but to bring it back to my interest and how it connects with NARM is to be able to work with my clients with this process of disidentification from how their identity may have formed in this context, and really, really honoring their process and their agency, their choice, their relationship to it as being very uniquely theirs, and not understanding that I may relate to parts of it, but not looking at it through my own filter or putting my own overlay or having an agenda for them.
Yeah. And at the same time, because you've been through this experience yourself, it can be very beneficial for you to be the one that guides people through this process.
I think so.
You said something earlier that made me really interested. You talked about how, you know, the way you were as a child. I mean, you were really taking the religion, taking the faith, taking the practice very seriously, and really taking it on. And you used the word internalize, and it made me think about what you said before, which is, I guess, something that I had said to you about this, that our culture, our religion is an extension of our attachment figures, of our primary caregivers, our parents generally. Mm-hmm. And that, so you were internalizing maybe through the vehicle of your parents, but the tenets, the beliefs, the customs of the culture. And I imagine, based on what you said before, that there was both beautiful aspects of it and aspects that didn't align with your authentic self or who you need to be. And I wonder, again, if you could talk a little bit about, like, what impact does that have in children, and as we're developing this identity, to be holding this complexity, particularly when, you know, generally our culture and our family are only supporting one side of it and kind of generally not realizing or acknowledging the other part of it.
Yeah, that's a really great question. You're asking a lot of really great questions.
Oh, I'm glad.
So for me, you know, looking back on my childhood, again, just the fabric that I was cut from, I have a very strong, passionate nature. I was kind of a wild child. I love spending a lot of time in nature, and a little bit unruly, you know, a little bit sassy. And my religion, the religion I grew up in, is very patriarchal. And that means that in the hierarchical system, the men have the power, and I think I learned pretty quickly that a little girl with a loud voice didn't have much of a place, and not just like in a neutral way, but I picked up pretty quickly that my nature, my strong nature, was a liability.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I foreclosed on those parts of myself, at least in visible ways, to conform and to be able to belong. Yeah. And I really tried hard to be good and to do the right thing, but then all along there's this sort of undercurrent of fear, right? Of then not doing the right thing and being emotionally rejected or punished or disapproved of. That was really painful for me as a child, on one level. And then on another level inside my church system, sinning in egregious ways, brings heavy consequence as well. And then being rejected or outcast from that community, that's survival right there, right? So living with a constant level of fear, and then understanding at some level too that my genuine, authentic self was not welcome, was really painful.
Yeah.
And of course, as a child, I don't think I could have articulated it in these words that I'm having with you right now.
Yeah.
But somatically, it left a big imprint.
No, that makes a lot of sense. We talk a lot in NARM, of course, about the fear of attachment loss, and you're talking about the ultimate fear of being disconnected from our community.
Yeah.
Which in many traditional cultures was like death. It was sort of life and death survival.
Yeah.
And I can imagine how when you grow up in a very tight-knit community with a lot of, norms built in about how you will be serving the community and serving the faith, that can be really threatening to think about. Just following your own path, following your own sense of self.
My goodness.
Yeah. That's
interesting, because even as you say that, even on the other side now, like I just had this kind of surge, like I just, like following your own path. That's pretty dangerous. And in fundamentalist religions, it's threatening to the community, and it's certainly not encouraged.
Yeah.
It's certainly not encouraged. So.
You talked before, which I had never heard this term before, the religious trauma syndrome.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about it. It just seems, again, like I think a lot of people, maybe not on such extreme levels, but on more maybe minor levels, can relate to that if they grew up in a community that was just close-knit even. So I wonder if we can just understand a little bit more, if you could share with us about your understanding of this religious trauma syndrome.
Yeah, so again, specifically it comes from Marlene Winkel, and she wrote this book called Leaving the Fold. Oh. In a nutshell, I think what she's talking about is these different stages of a transition where at first, a person starts to be like, well, something's not really working for me in this system, And maybe I should back up to say that one of the beautiful parts of a fundamentalist community is this sense of family and belonging, and being connected and having a place.
Yes.
So that was really, really orienting and really nourishing to me growing up in it.
Yeah.
And then becomes precisely the point of pain and the departure.
Yeah.
To where it's actually really alarming when I came to this point where I was like, this might not be right for me. And specific to this syndrome is then me starting to question myself rather than saying, oh, there could be something wrong with the system.
Yeah.
Right? It's me. And NARM really addresses that as well in developmental trauma, where this undeveloped consciousness has a really hard time understanding that it could be the family, the parents, the caregivers, the external system, and then puts it back on themselves. So for me, it was like, well, I must not be worthy or trying hard enough or reading my scriptures enough or serving the community or God enough. And so then I loop back into this cycle of, okay, I'm just going to try harder and try harder, with no satisfying results. In fact, it kind of makes it worse. So then starting to, and in her book, she actually outlines, I think, 4 or 5 different phases of this, this journey out, to where then if you make it to this point where it's like, maybe it is the system and maybe I'm going to create some distance, then, you know, we're up against these threats of losing the community and the attachment. And that's really, really painful. Right. And then going into a phase of disorientation on the other side, of identity, of meaning, of belonging, of like, even for me is like, how do I know, like I was taught as a child, like, here's how you know the truth. You know, it feels a certain way in your body and there's a certain effects in, you know, in your life that it creates. And then on the other side, it's like, oh my goodness, like, I don't even know how to know what's true anymore.
Yeah. Wow.
And then, you know, with enough support and time, and perseverance, like then coming to a place of like, of coming back into myself and feeling like the joy and the peace and the satisfaction, where that significant healing comes in. So I hope that kind of like gives a broad sense of this religious trauma syndrome, where it's like the initial phases, and then this period of deep pain and disorientation, and then hopefully coming out on the other side.
Yeah. You know, one of the most moving documentaries I ever saw, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, was about the Amish community. And they have this thing called, I think it's Rumspringer. I don't know how to pronounce it, but at 16 years old or so, they go out into the world. So they've been, you know, raised in a very isolated community, you know, with very disconnected from mainstream society, you know, no electricity and all that kind of stuff. So no media. And they go out into the world as a way to kind of determine if they're going to come back into the fold, into the community, or if they're going to go off on their own. And so there was a documentary about it. And the kids that chose to go off on their own, you know, they got trapped by all the kind of allure of the society of making money and having fun and you know, in the ways that children do and stuff. But then when they tracked them and followed them longer, the children that had decided to stay out, they fell into this despair because of what you're describing. I think it's because they didn't know, you know, after the honeymoon phase kind of wore off, then they were extremely disconnected and disoriented, and the loss and the grief was so profound. And they didn't know how to orient to the world without their community. And then, you know, I wondered also, they didn't talk about it in that documentary, but I wondered about the kids that had chosen to come back, and also about their experience of tasting this outside freedom. And then how did they reorient to bringing that back into their traditional lives? And I think on both sides, there's great challenge to that.
I think you're articulating that very well. Yeah.
So you went through your own personal process, and I'm guessing, I know you a little bit, I'm guessing that your foray into the world of trauma healing, you became a practitioner, a trauma practitioner. I'm guessing that was part of what's helped you to reorient in your life. Is that accurate?
I think absolutely. Yeah. And it wasn't so direct of a journey. About 10 years ago, I finished massage therapy school, and it was part of a reconnecting to the soulful part of myself that I'd mentioned earlier. And then a few years later, having worked in the field for a little while and working closely with bodies, I started becoming interested in somatic psychology. So that took me into a graduate program. Right, like this concept of trauma, although at the time I didn't identify with it. Like I didn't see myself as a traumatized person. But I was. I think it was just a slow process of, oh yeah, like I'm identifying with this more and more and understanding this more and more. And that's where I am now with being really curious as to how NARM addresses human development inside a fundamentalist religious community. So yes, being intellectually curious about it, but then also living that journey inside of me, and the healing as well, and the integrating and the coming back into myself, which, going back again to the complex nature of religious trauma, I remember distinctly a conversation you and I had once where I was touching into this this simultaneous victory of coming home to myself, my authentic self, and the loss, the substantial loss. I mean, I feel a lot of emotion coming up around that because it's real. And again, being able to hold both, like I don't know if I would go back and do anything differently. I don't know, but just like coming into myself is one of the most profound experiences of my life. And so is having lost so much along the way.
But you're providing me, and I hope people that are watching, really important actually wisdom around this process of not polarizing, of not splitting. Because I say this to my clients all the time, and it's a little bit of like a reductionistic way of looking at it, but it's like we really truly become adults when we can both love and hate our parents and not have to separate those two things. Like we can, and I think it's important in our intimate relationships as well, because we split and we separate those things. And I think that there's a power, I've watched you, and you're talking about it now, about how you've been able to hold both the beauty and the aspects that have really provided, this compass in your life and parts that are deeply meaningful to you, as well as the parts of you that just didn't fit or that felt threatening in different ways.
Right.
And that you're able to kind of hold them together and, grow from being present with the different parts of that experience.
And as long as you're talking about that, or while you're talking about it, I mean, I'm seeing how really important coming back into my body was in that process to be able to hold both. And again, just going back in my path and my interest in somatics and reconnecting there. And that was one of the things I did lose along the way in my religion, not because anyone made me per se, but the way that I internalized it and lived it was, it was supported by the theology and the culture around like sin and carnal nature being in the body, and then everything that's good and light and pure and ideal and spiritual and of God is not. So then, along the way, like, leaving my, my somatic self, but coming back into it and having that really be the anchor that helps me to hold both, which is a new experience, by the way. I mean, I think you know that. So, but I think you're right. Yeah, being able to hold both is pretty critical. And the words of advice are, well, one, you're certainly not alone. Yeah. And I think there's tremendous value even in all of the disorientation, to be able to feel into as best as one can, to follow the little breadcrumb trail in the forest, and to acknowledge that it's okay to trust yourself and those signals of distress or dissonance that are emerging, and it's okay to be curious about it in your own time and in your own way, and to see where that leads you. Yeah.
Well, it's really hopeful. And, I think that book is a really good resource as well. It was Leaving the Fold.
Leaving the Fold. Yep.
Leaving the Fold, about the religious trauma syndrome. And yeah, Jenny, I just really appreciate you taking time. I know this is, can be a very sensitive kind of topic for people, and perhaps you still even. And I just think it's so valuable that we bring this on into the awareness. And like, you know, like I said, so many people are struggling with it either quietly or not so quietly. And I think just spending some time kind of looking at it can be a resource in and of itself. So thank you so much for taking the time.
It's my pleasure. And again, thank you for suggesting this conversation in the first place. Yeah.
Happy to do this.
Right.